Grief has a way of distorting time, stretching days into eternity while suffocating you with memories you'd rather forget. I wanted solitude, a chance to find myself again, among the trees and the silence. But solitude has its own voice. It whispers to you in the rustle of leaves, the crack of a branch, the shift of shadows just beyond the firelight. Out there, where the world feels ancient and alive, I learned the hard way that some silences aren't empty. They're waiting for you to let your guard down, waiting for the moment when you're the most vulnerable. It's been a few weeks since my father passed. After the funeral, I felt an unbearable weight pressing down on me, a mix of grief, exhaustion, and questions about where my life was headed. I couldn't focus on anything, and the walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. So I decided to pack up and spend the weekend camping, just me and my dog, Bear. It wasn't supposed to be anything crazy, just a quiet getaway to clear my mind and figure out how to move forward. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far away from the usual campsites. I wanted solitude. The location was perfect. A clearing surrounded by towering pines, the faint sound of a creek nearby, and no sign of human activity. Bear seemed happy too, sniffing around and wagging his tail as I set up camp. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and sat down to take in the serenity of the place. The first day was uneventful, just peaceful silence and the occasional chirping of birds. That evening, I sat by the fire, staring at the flames and trying to make sense of my thoughts. The fire crackled softly, and the warmth was comforting against the cool night air. Bear curled up at my feet, his steady breathing a grounding presence. When it got late, he retreated into the tent, and I fell asleep to the soothing sounds of the forest. The next morning, I woke up early to gather more wood for the fire. I didn't think much about leaving the tent open. We were so deep in the woods, who would be out there? But when I returned, something felt off. My gear was scattered, my backpack unzipped, and my food supply had been rifled through. At first, I thought maybe Bear had gotten curious, but he'd never done anything like this before. Besides, the way things were strewn about, it felt deliberate, almost methodical. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a raccoon or some other animal. I convinced myself it was nothing and went about my day. I hiked a bit, explored the creek, and tried to enjoy the beauty of nature, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. Every time a branch snapped or the wind rustled the leaves, I found myself looking over my shoulder. That night, as I sat by the fire, I couldn't help but feel exposed. The woods, once peaceful, now felt oppressive. Shadows danced just beyond the firelight, and every crack of a twig made me jump. Bear seemed on edge too, his ears perking up at every little sound. He kept glancing towards the darkness, his body tense. I told myself I was just being paranoid. I put out the fire and crawled into the tent, Bear following close behind. It took me a while to fall asleep, but eventually I did. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to Bear growling low in his throat. My heart starting to race, I listened carefully and heard it. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, as the footsteps circled the campsite. Bear's growls turned into low whines, his body pressed against mine. Whoever it was never came close enough for me to see them through the tent fabric. But they didn't leave either. The steps would come and go, sometimes stopping for minutes at a time before starting up again. I clutched the small camping knife I'd brought, my mind racing with every worst-case scenario. Hours seemed to pass. At some point, the footsteps stopped entirely, but I didn't sleep a wink. As soon as dawn broke, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't even bother making breakfast. The forest felt wrong, like it was watching me. The once inviting trees now loomed over me, their shadows stretching unnaturally long in the early morning light. Bear stayed close to me as we hiked back to the car. Every so often he'd stop, sniff the air, and growl softly. My nerves were frayed, and every sound, a bird call, the rustle of leaves, hell, even my own footsteps, set my heart racing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief so intense it almost knocked me over. But as I was loading up the trunk, I noticed something there. On the dusty back window was a single handprint, smudged, but unmistakably human. My stomach dropped, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I don't know who was out there with me, or what they wanted. I don't know how long they'd been watching me, or how close they'd come to the tent while I slept. But one thing is certain, I'll never go camping again alone. To whoever was stalking me in the woods that night, I hope we never meet again. Even now, back in the safety of my home, the events of that night linger like a shadow in my mind. I went into the woods seeking clarity, hoping to mend the frayed edges of my grief and exhaustion. But instead, I left with more questions, ones that I can't answer and may never want to. I don't know who was out there, or why they chose to watch me. Were they just curious? Were they waiting for the right moment to act? Or was their presence some strange reminder that even in solitude, we're never truly alone? What I do know is this: I'll never hear the crack of a branch or the whisper of the wind without remembering that night. I'll never feel the same way about the woods or the sense of calm they once brought me. That serenity has been replaced by an unease I can't shake. The woods taught me a lesson I'll never forget. The feeling of being watched isn't always just in your head, and sometimes it's better not to look back.